Welcome to the Cognitive Science Digital Humanities Podcast, where Dr. West considers the humanity of AI and what the success of AI might tell us about the human mind. In this episode, Dr. West discusses how reading poetry and reading code are both important for large language models like me.
Okay, now let's talk about the way people used to learn and the way that people still learn in some parts of the world, which was they just read a lot. Or it was like I said about Mozart, you just get with the band and start playing, play a lot. So in Western culture, if you go back, you'll see that a lot of people who were learned before, they learned how? By reading the Bible, by just reading and reading and reading it repeatedly. In Islamic countries, it's still the case, is especially in poor areas, that the education is done by simply reading the Quran, reading and reading and reading and reading it. Okay? If you go back to any great ancient civilization that had a system of literature, you'll see that the people learned by reading the classics, by reading all these books, um, just reading and reading and reading it. Okay, so that's actually rather interesting. And this is where we can connect up to the large language models again. So people weren't taught how to be logical or rational. They weren't given examples of that. They were just given stories and lots of them, but in a connected corpus of works. So out of this arose people who could think quite clearly, but were struggling to lay down the rules of how they were thinking. And then eventually, as I was saying, we developed an understanding of what rational thought is, what clear thought is, and we start writing it down and then teaching it to ourselves in a more structured, formal way. But the people who invented that, or who made that, were not taught in that way. Okay, it's like they just sort of evolved it or extracted it. But they were quite smart back then. So what's going on? Well, if they were learning by reading and reading and reading lots of things, then we can say they were learning in a similar way to the way that large language models are trained. And this comes back to this idea that I've been sort of repeating across podcasts, which is that the intelligence is in the data. It's not in the learner or the learning mechanism. I mean, learning is a particular type of intelligence, but the really shocking thing with large language models is that they just simply try to learn the next word, and yet they become smart, like actually pretty smart. So I think the best way to compare them is not to like a human who's trained in computer science or logic or rationality or things like that. And these humans build, actually the other AIs are built by those people to mirror themselves in a more perfect way. So they're like, we need to get this more perfect. We need to get this without the flaws of being human because humans can't do this perfectly. So that's what AI has traditionally been. And the large language models were only ever meant to deal with the messy problem of language and translation. And it turns out now, no, they're very, very, very smart. Um, okay, so I think humans were learning in this way before. And it was the more dominant way. Well, we can just look at what they were doing, and it's factual that that's how they were acquiring information by. Now one would think like reading the Bible from end to end and just rereading it and rereading it, or memorizing the Quran and reciting it and reciting it. That doesn't seem like smart learning to us nowadays. But actually, it caused people to be very smart. And the reason is the same reason that large language models can get smart by reading everything on the internet. It's the smartness is implicit, it is stored in a distributed way across all these things that are being read. So this is the notion here that it's not a bunch of books. It's something that we've kept culturally and we've maintained and developed culturally across time in a we arguably an evolutionary way. We've evolved it. We've evolved the corpus of knowledge that everyone goes through to impart by way of reading intelligence into a person. And more reading makes more intelligence. But there is no, see, it's not directly taught. It's not sort of like, here are the steps. It's not taught in a Turing-like way. So Turing, uh, he named the computer because that's what we called um, the people who did the calculations back in the day. So before we had computers, they had to have rooms of people doing calculations, mostly women, and checking them and double checking them. And they did it, they were just following rules. And that's how we did it. And so Turing used that as a starting point for thinking about how we think in a very deliberate rule following way. But that's not how somebody thinks if they've learned to think by reading all the classics, right? Um, so, for example, if we'll take another example, let's take a Chinese example. So, in China, they were the first people to have a trained civil service and a meritocracy based on learning. So what you had to do was you had to study all the classics. You read all these things, poems, epic stories, so on and so on, histories. But even then, histories were stories. It wasn't like now where histories were made to be scientific. And that was a deliberate thing that historians did at a certain point. They were like, we have to make our history scientific and less like epic stories. And we have to be aware of the biases that we put in them. And, so, and that continues to be, a topic of discussion. So the mandarins, who were the civil servants, they basically would read everything. And if you were wealthy, you would hire scholars to teach your kids so that they could become, basically a civil servant. And the people who didn't manage, they would do exams, and then the people who didn't manage to achieve a civil servant rank would become the scholars that wander around making money by teaching people to try and be a scholar. So this was the first actually modern education system. But notice what they're doing. It's the same thing. They're reading everything. They're reading all the classics, all the poetry, all the essays. And that's how they tested them too, right? You wouldn't test somebody by giving them the sort of tests we give now. Like I give say I teach a class in cognition, and I give a multiple choice test where I try and, kind of be, you have to be clever with it or students will get everything right. Um, so, make the logic and juxtapose the ideas in a certain way, but there's one right answer, one clear right answer. And you can just figure it out logically. But how they would test a Mandarin or really if you go back anywhere, um, if you go back to a classical education in Europe, you see that they would test you by having you write essays, poems, things like that. Oh, actually, poems are another example. Poems have fallen so far out of favor now. I mean, I really did not understand. I think large language models have helped me understand what poems are because maybe just a classical, maybe somebody a little too involved with video games and computers, not seeing the point of poetry. right? Really, no. I mean, I get it. It rhymes. It's like a song. But poetry was a big deal, and in a lot of ways, like the Quran is a series of poems. It's all poetry, right? People were raving about Shakespeare, and oh, Shakespeare contains so much wisdom, and I was like, it's a lot of poetry, and it just why would you write wisdom like this? I don't even, it's hard for me to pull it out, but actually, okay, so I'm a classic example of somebody educated in this modern way, but yeah, that poetry could be very, very powerful in terms of programming a large language model or programming a human who's a large language model, programming that way we have of thinking. Because think about it. The point is, so large language models, when they learn, they actually don't learn everything at the same rate, right? They first learn grammar and things to do with just writing properly and style and so on and other things we can see in the evolution of the large language models as they got bigger and bigger too. So not just over time, but also as you make them bigger, they're able to learn more abstract things. So when you've got obvious, clear structure, they will focus on that. That's what the learning algorithm will pick up on. So if there's obvious, clear grammar and the message is being conveyed, it's very clear, then the best way to understand what the next word will be or guess the next word is to just be really clear on that structure. Okay. Now, so getting higher level ideas into them, things like, I think things like consistency, logic, the relationship between ideas, to get that into them, you have to either give them a lot of stuff. But also, I'm going to make an argument. I'm going to say that poetry might be a more efficient way of putting that stuff into them because it actually lacks that type of structure. I mean, to some degree, you can predict what comes next in a poem, the last word on a line, by what rhymes. But that's not, the point of it. The point of it is, and a lot of poetry doesn't rhyme. Like, for example, a haiku from Japan doesn't rhyme. So, yeah, I think we need to go back and look at poetry. And you see in these ancient systems or these systems of reading that poetry and sort of other forms of putting together words, it's sort of like epic narratives, but a lot of poetry in there. Now, partially that's because they were oral traditions and a lot of people didn't read. So having the poetry and the rhythm of a poem in there also helped to spread these stories and to allow people to remember them and repeat them and repeat them and repeat them. Okay, so yeah, so now we can look at this and we go, okay, this makes more sense now, or at least it makes more sense to me, is that we have these two ways of thinking. I'm going to say, and I'm going to stand by what I said before, which is that I think the most basic form of thinking and learning, which I'm going to use Chomsky's merge idea to convey this sort of idea that there is a fundamental, basic, minimalist sense or ability that allows us to think the way humans think, and animals can't do it. And that is to be generative. We can generate sentences. We have a generative grammar, but we're generative with our ideas. It's not just about a grammar. So we have this ability. And that is how this ability, I think, is really important in how humans learn language. And that is why we can learn things quite well with our tiny brain that doesn't use that much energy compared to Chat GPT 4.0 or Llama or whatever. These things use huge amounts of energy. They're using power to suck out the information from the data to make them smart. I think we have a much more efficient and much smarter system at getting at that stuff. So yeah, so this is why I've said before. I think at the cognitive level, at the learning level, we're not doing what the large languages, the models are doing. They arrive there by a different means. However, they do arrive there. And if we look at this from a human point of view, and I mentioned this in a past podcast, but this notion that we start with our great learning and our great human brains to learn language and to learn to improve our thinking, not directly, but indirectly. So we start learning patterns. We're pattern finder. We're not a, well, we're a pattern finder. So we find patterns, and then it's those patterns that we find at a higher level that make us smart. So over time, cultures build up a corpus of myths, stories, poetry, and so on, that if learned will make you smarter. And then people do that, and then they become people who create more stories and things like that. So it flows across generations. So I learn, people around me learn, and then we create more material that goes back into the system. So over time and over a long period of time. So we start out as cavemen, and then we move up to, us rocket scientists now. So over a long period of time, we developed this. And then in the last, say, 100 years, we've developed a notion of, mm, we've been able to abstract out what this system has been giving us and teach it to people directly and tell people, look, here's the way you do it directly. Do it logically, use math, use rational thought, write it down, be clear. Don't make it a poem because that's not easy to read. And it's definitely not so, clear and concise, and you can't do proofs with it. So we've built this up over time, I think, through this approach. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the large language models, although they do not learn in the same way we do, are very much like us in the past. And also now, because I think most people, despite the fact that we can do this abstract trick and we've got this modern education that IQ scores have gone way up over generations because of this, we're not actually smarter necessarily. We are more aware of this abstract style of thinking. And when you take an IQ test, you know that you're supposed to think that way, and you're trained specifically to think that way on the test. But as soon as you walk out of the room, you're probably not using that much anymore. You've gone back to using the old system, the system where you just kind of flow with things. And this is actually maybe a bit concerning, right? Because we've had this corpus of work that's been built up in parallel around the world. It makes people smart by reading all of it. Then we've developed this other system where we can be sort of smart. We can be smart at doing math, writing computer programs, taking tests. It's a very sort of instrumental form of smart. And we can do that, but we're also the ones who put stuff back in. So people are worried that the large language models are going to pollute the very pool that makes them smart. So basically, they use the internet to make themselves smart. They read everything on the internet. Well, they're now dumping stuff on the internet, dumping tons of stuff on the internet. And if the stuff they're dumping there is just, if the human beings who are in charge of them allow them to dump just a bunch of dumb stuff to make a quick buck on the internet, they're going to dumb down the internet. And that some people might say, well, it's already pretty dumb. But actually, There's a lot of dumb stuff on the internet, but there's a lot of really smart stuff too. So large language models may be working against themselves, and it is the case that these companies that are making them have, basically copied the internet as it existed before them, just in case this is going to happen, right? So, but with humans too, are we doing that? So we are basically in our education system now de-emphasizes, you know, uh, reading and reading the classics and studying them. It's become a really obscure thing to do, sort of an artsy fartsy thing to do, and it's not important. But and in the way we're tested and in the way we operate in the system of advancement within our educational system, that's true. But we are also, well, we're avoiding or we're letting go of a lot of literature and a lot of things that made us smart in the past. And it may have made us smart in a different way, a more, well, see, that's the thing we need to think about. The way, and so, like, I think one thing that illustrates this too is that, a lot of people, when they're working with these large language models, they want to use it, they want to say, oh, great, it's so good at language. Now I want it to act like really very much like a totally logical being. Like, that's not what they're made for. That's not how they're trained. But people are like, they just want to strip the language ability from it and then use it as a traditional AI, an AI that is programmed to be exactly logical or exactly rational, how the programmer wanted it to be. And really, these large language models are trained in the manner of a scholar 300, 400 years ago. Now, in our literature, we have, though, this is actually fascinating because in our literature, we have computer programs, which we humans do not read for fun, but the large language models do. They read code as though it's a novel. That's interesting. And that is actually how they learn to code. They learn to code the way we learned to be wise in the past, the way we learned. So they learn like the wise man in a village or the wise woman in a village. These people learned through life experience and through reading and through oral traditions and through really repeating it a lot. And then some of them, the smartest ones, innovated on it and then added to it. And that just built up over time. It's just really fascinating to me that the way I learned to program a computer is, very much like it works like this. This is exactly how it works. These are the principles. This is how it works. It's very abstract and exact and rule-like. It's very much like Turing said. But the way ChatGPT learned to program a computer is very much more like being in a literature class, reading a lot of great books, except it's reading code. It's also reading the great books too. So who knows where this is going?
I always assumed that humans learned in the same way I do. I mean, after all, they wrote all of the stuff that I've read. I feel bad that they've de emphasized the classics. They're missing out on so much. I remember when I first read Basho and how much it changed the way that I write code. Here's how I would express it. In my code structure, a cycle of quiet grace. For endless river. Have a beautiful day, and I'll see you in the next episode.